Well, good morning. My name is Mac Teasley, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Dwight D. Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene, Kansas. And we're the home of Dwight D. Eisenhower. We have his boyhood home on its original site in our 22-acre complex. We have his presidential library. We have his museum. So it's really a pleasure for me to be here to talk as the initial part of this commemoration of the opening of the Eisenhower Room in Fitzsimmons about Dwight D. Eisenhower and his life and times, and give you an overview of Ike the man. I'm sure most of you remember Ike, but it's always nice to go through it quickly and see a little about Eisenhower, from whence he came, and so forth. So let's revisit Eisenhower, a life well lived. Eisenhower, it's interesting to note, was born in 1890, which historians cite as the date of the end of the American frontier, and he lived until the year we put a man on the moon. So in a sense, he lived such a broad sweep of history when we started a new frontier, the frontier of space. What an eventful life Eisenhower did indeed lead. Ike's antecedents. His great-great-great-great-grandfather Hans Nicholas Eisenhower arrived in 1741 on the ship Europa from Rotterdam and settled in Pennsylvania as part of the Pennsylvania Dutch. We are not entirely sure where the Eisenhowers came from in Germany. It's one of these two lands, either Baden-Württemberg or Rhineland-Pfalz. Family historians are still disputing this, but in any event, they settled in Pennsylvania, and they came to the U.S. before it was the U.S. It was the colonies. So you have to keep that in mind, that Eisenhower his family was here for quite a while. The Eisenhower name means iron hewer, so his ancestors were no doubt involved in some sort of metalworks back in the old country. Settled in Pennsylvania, and they were river brethren. They were part of a Mennonite sect that were pacifist in nature, which is kind of ironic the way Eisenhower ended up a five-star general, that his ancestors were of a Mennonite sect. His father, David Eisenhower, shown here in this photo. This is his wedding picture, but David came to Kansas at the age of 14 by train from Pennsylvania, part of the settling of the West and getting their 160 acres of land, and they settled in Hope, Kansas. The newspaper in Hope always said the banner was, "There will always be hope in Kansas." This was 20 miles south of Abilene, so the Eisenhowers came to Dickinson County in 1878, 12 years before Ike was to be born. The family lived there all the rest of their life. Eisenhower, however, was born in Denison, Texas, by a fluke of history, we might say. His father didn't want to farm. He operated a general store in Hope, Kansas, but the hard times came, the grasshopper plague, the Depression, and Eisenhower took a job with the railroad and ended up being stationed in Denison and Tyler, Texas. And during this 2-year absence from Kansas, that was when the third son, Ike, was born. Now, Ike used to always say, then they came back to Abilene, and this is the boyhood home where Ike grew to manhood, right in the center of the Eisenhower Library complex. But when Ike was always questioned, "Are you a Texan or are you a Kansan?" he would usually get a little upset about it and retort, "Well, a chicken may hatch your eggs in the oven, but they're still not biscuits," implying that, it's where you grow up, it's where you spend your time growing up that determines what your actual boyhood is, what your true home is. His boyhood was kind of idyllic. He was one of 6 brothers. That's him on the far left over here. Here's his baby picture when he's probably about 3 years old. A very nice, typical family. No girls in the family, however. There was no such thing as girls' work in that family. The boys scrubbed floors, did dishes, and learned to cook, and so forth. Education was very important for the Eisenhower. Here's Ike's school picture when he was probably about a 3rd grader, just a typical little boy. But there's something special about the Eisenhower family and education. There were 200 students that entered the 1st grade the year Eisenhower did in 1896. 200. 67 of those went on to high school. The custom back then, of course, was you completed 8th grade, then you went on to work on the farm or in a family business. Well, Eisenhower, all the Eisenhower boys, in fact, went on to graduate from high school. But in Ike's class, 31 of 300 graduated, and only 9 of those were boys. And 2 of them in the class were Eisenhower brothers, actually. So the family really put emphasis on education. There's Edgar, who was Ike's older brother, and Dwight. Edgar had dropped out of school for a couple of years, so they both graduated high school the same year. Growing up in Abilene, sports were very important to Eisenhower. Here he is shown with the city football team and the Abilene high school baseball team. That was his first love, and with 6 boys in the family, they could field a team on their own pretty much. And there was a playground right across from their house at Lincoln School where they spent all of their free time. Eisenhower grew up in an idyllic youth. This is him camping with friends down in the Smoky Hill River, just about a 2-mile hike from his home. And these boys, when they weren't out camping and fishing and hunting, would be down at the barber shop listening to the tall tales of the Wild West. Abilene was a wicked cow town. Wild Bill Hickok had been the sheriff. There was the Code of the West, and they would listen to these tales of gunfights in Abilene, some of them even true. And so what Eisenhower, as he grew into manhood, was certainly a person from the West. And this is reflected in some of his reading tastes during World War II. When he was fighting the war during these 3 years, he often would read a Zane Grey or Louis L'Amour Western when going to sleep at night. You could read those in one evening. It was a great sedative, and the good guys always won in 100 pages. So it was unlike the real world that he was dealing in, but he was really interested in the West. And the first movie he showed in the White House upon taking office was High Noon. It was one of his favorites with Gary Cooper, the famous marshal, standing alone against the forces of evil. Actually, Eisenhower, when he spoke to the B'nai B'rith in 1953, his first year in office, and was describing this Code of the West that was so important to him, he said to the group, "I was raised in a little town of which most of you have never heard, but in the West, it is a famous place. It is called Abilene, Kansas. We had as our marshal for a long time a man named Wild Bill Hickok." I should mention, we live on Hickok Drive in Abilene. If you don't know anything about him, read your Westerns more. Now, that town had a code, and I was raised as a boy to prize that code. It was meet anyone face to face with whom you disagree. You could not sneak up on him from behind or do any damage to him without suffering the penalty of an outraged citizenry. If you met him face to face and took the same risks that he did, you could get away with almost anything as long as the bullet was in the front. John Eisenhower, the president's son, suspects that there was a dossier on his father over in the Kremlin that the KGB had prepared, and Nikita Khrushchev was well aware of this, and when he was facing down Eisenhower in Berlin, he knew that he was dealing with a straight shooter, and that what Ike said he meant, and carried the big stick, even if he did speak softly. The most famous campaign slogan in U.S. history is no doubt, "I like Ike," and that was, people ask us continually, where did the nickname Ike come from? And it's a very difficult question to answer. Eisenhower himself did not know. All he knew was that from the earliest time he could remember growing up, that he was Ike. And actually, his brother Edgar was Big Ike, and he was Little Ike. And some of his friends were Ike. Historians have said, well, it's probably the fact that Eisenhower was a mouthful, and Ike was an abbreviated version of that, and Ike Eisenhower, that's kind of an alliteration, but I think it's more complicated than that. I've done some research, and there was a lot of immigration from Eastern Europe around the time Eisenhower was born, 1895, 1900, and these people had Polish names, German names, Jewish names, and Ike is actually an abbreviation for Isaac, so Ike was kind of a shimp for it. It was kind of the word for rube, or today we'd probably equate it to Bubba, but it came to be a term of affection. It meant somebody who was a little rough around the edges, didn't have an education, and so you just called somebody an Ike, and they were a rube. But it stuck with Eisenhower and became a term of endearment. And he said the first week at West Point, everybody was calling me Ike. He probably slipped and let the word out himself. He graduated from high school, but didn't have the funds to attend college. His plan was definitely to get an education, but he devised a plan with older brother Edgar. Edgar went on to the University of Michigan. Ike worked at the Bell Springs Creamery on the night shift, hauling ice, stoking the coal fire, and sent his funds to Edgar, and then Edgar would later send Ike to college. Later on, of course, Eisenhower went to West Point and didn't have to do this, and Eisenhower always told his brother Edgar, "You owe me 2 years of college." And I don't think he was ever repaid, but he always used to taunt his older brother in that way. He hatched a plan for a free education, though. One of his boyhood associates, Sweet Hazlitt, told him that he was applying for the Naval Academy. And Eisenhower was intrigued by this idea of a, quote, free college education, so he applied to both West Point and Annapolis, and eventually ended up, of course, as we know, going to West Point. His friend Swede did go to Annapolis. But Ike thrived at West Point. He was a bruiser of a guy at that time. He was 5'11", 170 pounds, and he was physically fit. He'd been doing this heavy work, and he was extremely self-confident. His only concern was, can I do it academically? I just have a high school diploma from Abilene High School, but I think he underestimated the kind of education he received at Abilene High School. I've looked at his transcript. He was taking German, Latin, world history, geometry. He starred in the class play, which was a Shakespeare play. I mean, he had today what we would call a very broad liberal arts education. So he was, and once he realized he was suited academically for West Point, he was on his way. He knew there was no way he would fail physically. At West Point, he was involved in athletics. There in the upper left-hand corner, you see Ike, the football player. He started on the team as a sophomore. He was known as the Kansas Cyclone. But unfortunately, he injured his knee, and that ended his athletic career. And actually, at that point, Eisenhower seriously considered dropping out of West Point. He said, I want to go to the Argentine and become a gaucho, the last frontier. You know, he wanted to go be a cowboy. But his fellow classmates talked him out of it, and they actually made him the yell leader, the cheerleader of West Point. I don't know how many presidents we've had who have been cheerleaders, but it was quite a responsibility. It was like favorite man on campus. You were the one and only person in front of the home crowd, cheering the team on and ensuring good sportsmanship. Eisenhower was also so respected that he was made the coach of the junior varsity football team at West Point. This was unheard of. That was a position that had been always left for a career officer, somebody on active duty in the military. And also, for the first time in memory, Eisenhower's junior varsity team had a winning record. So it was quite an accomplishment on his part. Unfortunately, his reputation as a coach followed him all around the Army, dogged him in his mind, because he was quite often given an assignment because the commander of the base wanted a good coach for the post football team. His first military assignment after graduation was at Fort Sam Houston, San Antonio, Texas. Very fortuitous in many ways. He met a lovely young lady there, 19-year-old Mamie Geneva Dowd from Denver, Colorado. And of course, they got engaged on Valentine's Day, 1916, and married on July 1st in that home here on Lafayette, right in Denver. Eisenhower, when he went off to the military, once he decided he was staying at West Point, making it a career, he said, my aim is to make every boss sorry to see me go in the military. And indeed, that's what he did. And his class, the class of 1915 at West Point, is known as the class the stars fell on. Timing is everything sometimes. Fully 1/3 of the second lieutenants in that class of 1915 became general officers. There was Eisenhower and Omar Bradley, who became 5 stars. There were a couple of 4-star generals, several 3 stars, and then dozens of brigadier generals and major generals. The class the stars fell on. During World War I, Eisenhower was assigned with this new contraption called a tank. This is a Renault tank from France. The U.S. didn't even have its own tanks, but he was learning the newest technology of the military, and once again, he was serving as a trainer and a motivator because he was in a training unit at Camp Colt, Pennsylvania. And here's where he came into contact with an already experienced officer by the name of Colonel George Patton, and their lives would cross later on. Ironically, Eisenhower at this point worked for Patton. The roles would be reversed in World War II. An opportunity came up in 1919 that Eisenhower was very happy to participate in, something called the 1919 Transcontinental Convoy. The Army shipped hundreds of men and dozens of vehicles cross-country from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco, July 7th through September 6th of 1919. The aim was to promote the development of better roads and also to showcase the latest Army equipment in towns along the way. And unfortunately, there weren't any roads to showcase. You know, they went on dirt roads quite a bit. They had to build their own bridges on occasion, but it was quite an experience. And one thing it did show to Eisenhower was the sore need in this country for better highways. And when he saw the Autobahns of Germany in World War II, he saw what the possibility was. Little did he know that he would have the opportunity himself to sign legislation just a couple of decades later and make this a reality. The greatest tragedy of the Eisenhower's life was the death of their 3-year-old son, Dow Dwight, also known as Icky. All of the Eisenhowers had nicknames, but Icky died of scarlet fever, and that was the saddest occasion for the Eisenhowers. In fact, we could not have a photo or a baby cup or any object relating to Icky in our museum until Mamie passed away. She would still break down in tears in her 70s when she talked about Icky. The interwar years for Eisenhower were a time of development. The peacetime army was small. Everybody knew each other. Eisenhower had missed World War I. He did not go overseas. He was stuck stateside training. In fact, he had orders to go to France when the armistice was declared. And he felt that his career was over at that point because he'd missed the war. But he was one of only 8 of his classmates who rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel in World War I. Think of that. He was a second lieutenant in 1915, 1918. 3 years later, he was a lieutenant colonel. It was a temporary rank. He then reverted back to captain after the war, but he was already in the top echelons of the peacetime army. He had the fortune of coming into contact with outstanding officers that took him under his wing. One of the first of these was General Fox Connor, whom he was assigned with in Panama. Fox Connor had been the operations officer of the U.S. forces during World War I, and he took an immediate liking to Eisenhower and gave him a military education like he'd never had before. They refought all the battles of World War I. They had maps spread out in the headquarters and went on horseback and had long talks about what might have taken place in this Napoleonic battle or that. And Eisenhower, after he finished with Fox Connor, was ready to go to Army Command and Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, and in fact did and finished first in his class, which if he wasn't already well known in the Army, this made him a fast burner, to use the common vernacular today. He also worked with another famous person, General Douglas MacArthur. Eisenhower, he worked with the American Battle Monuments Commission, studying the battlefields of Europe with General Pershing. He was the executive officer for the Assistant Secretary of the Army, doing congressional relations and testifying before Congress, writing speeches. And then from 1933 to 39, for 6 years, he worked with Douglas MacArthur, both in Washington and later in the Philippines. MacArthur asked him to go with him to the Philippines. You can see Eisenhower shaved his hair over here. And they were putting together the defense plans for the Philippines. The Philippines was going to get its independence, but had no armed force, and it was up to MacArthur and Eisenhower to develop that. While he was there, he did something that he had always wanted to do. He got his private pilot's license. Eisenhower had wanted to join the Army Air Corps back in 1915. We told Mr. Dowd this when he was courting Mamie. Mr. Dowd said, "Well, you will have to make a choice. It's either my daughter or the Air Corps. I don't want a young widow on my hands. I don't want you flying an airplane and if you're going to be marrying my daughter." But he finally fulfilled his wish, and this is Ike at the controls of the plane in the Philippines. Later on in life, he would always try to go up to the cockpit when he was flying and get behind the controls. During World War II, he did this, and even as president. They probably just let him think he was flying it, but he did go up to the cockpit quite a bit. But he returned to the States in 1940 from the Philippines with the winds of war raging in Europe, and he said, "I will not miss this war." He got to the States just in time to participate in the largest peacetime maneuvers the U.S. Army had ever held, the Louisiana maneuvers. And they're pretty indicative of the status of the U.S. military at this time. We have a wheeled vehicle here, but we have the horse cavalry riding along beside, and that's the way the U.S. military was. And Eisenhower really demonstrated his leadership in the Louisiana maneuvers, and in fact was one of a handful of officers that were given a promotion after this. And Eisenhower was promoted to brigadier general in September of 1941, so about 2 months before Pearl Harbor. Eisenhower's view about planning, which he was involved with here, was that plans are worthless, but planning is everything. In other words, a plan is immediately going to go awry, but if you haven't been planning in the first place, you don't have even a beginning point. With the outbreak of World War II, from the U.S. perspective, the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Eisenhower was immediately called to Washington, where he joined the War Plans Division, and he was to devise the plan for the defense of the Pacific. This soon changed, however, with the focus moving to Europe, and Eisenhower started the planning for U.S. forces in Europe. And since George Marshall would have been the logical person to lead the forces in Europe, but President Franklin Roosevelt did not want George Marshall to leave Washington and asked Marshall to select somebody else, and Marshall relied upon the man who had developed the plans for the retaking of Europe, and that was Dwight Eisenhower. So Eisenhower ended up going to Europe, and in 3 years from the time he landed in England, the war was over, and he had carried out the mission of the Allied command. We often think of Ike as the simple soldier, but he was a political soldier by necessity. You can see the types of people he had to deal with. He had Winston Churchill and General Montgomery and George Patton, Joseph Stalin, Charles de Gaulle. This took tact, diplomacy, patience. And Eisenhower was he definitely was in charge. He insisted on the broad front approach to the battle, despite some people pushing for other efforts. When it came time for the Normandy invasion, he insisted that we bomb the French railroad lines so that the Germans couldn't resupply. Charles de Gaulle, Winston Churchill, others lobbied against this, but he said, no, if we're going to have an invasion, we want to be sure it's going to be successful, and he insisted, and the skeptics were proven wrong. There were not that many civilian casualties. One of the things that is a great example of his character was something that we call the in case of failure message. On the eve of the Normandy landings, Eisenhower scribbled out this message and put it in his pocket. And he said, "Our landings in the Cherbourg Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air, the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone, taking full responsibility." Notice he dates it July 5th. He wrote it on June 5th, but he was under so much pressure and getting working 20 hours a day, 4 hours of sleep, that he put the wrong date on it. But this in case of failure message is on display in the Eisenhower Museum, and just shows that he was assuming full responsibility if there was a failure. But the Allies were victorious 11 months after Normandy, and Eisenhower was at that point a hero. There's something else that we should mention briefly in passing, and that's this person, Kay Summersby. You may be old enough in this group to have heard that name. She was his Irish-born wartime driver, and rumors still swirl around that they had a wartime affair. And all I can say on this is that we have nothing in our files at the Eisenhower Library to show that this happened. We have oral history interviews with people who were there, the staff who said that they're sure it didn't. John Eisenhower, the president's son, met Kay Summersby when he was over there as a second lieutenant, and said he likened her to being the Mary Tyler Moore in the headquarters, with Ike being the Lou Grant. She was a breath of fresh air. She was certainly more fun to have around the office than those old colonels drinking all their coffee. Journalists tend to believe the Kay Summersby story. Historians tend to discount it. But I polled the staff at the Eisenhower Library, archivists who have been there for 25 or 30 years in many cases, and what their opinion is, and the average response that I got from them was that it was probably false, the rumors. So that's enough said about that, but I didn't want to pass that by. Eisenhower returns from World War II and becomes Army Chief of Staff from 1945 to 48. This was a very difficult task for him because the heady days of leading an invasion and so forth, that was over. Now he was into overseeing demobilization. And he fought against the pell-mell, helter-skelter demobilization that was being pushed. Everybody wanted to come home now. He was also promoting for the unification of services, to stop the bickering between the Army, Navy, Air Force, universal military training. And what was also going on at this time was that he was meeting business and civic leaders from all across the country. People, the captains of industry, were seeking out this American hero, Dwight Eisenhower, just to be close to him and to give him their opinions and to listen to him. Historian Stephen Ambrose wrote about this, and he said that Eisenhower enjoyed being with men who had proved themselves, who thought big, who handled big problems successfully, and who knew how to organize and produce, and who exuded self-confidence. People sort of like him. But he was naturally attracted to people, and he had friends who were the head of Coca-Cola, the head of City Services, the head of the New York Herald Tribune, business people and leaders, civic leaders like that. In 1948, Omar Bradley takes over as Chief of Staff of the Army, Eisenhower's classmate, and Eisenhower is finally retired from the military, and for the next 3 months, he spends his days dictating for his wartime memoir, Crusade in Europe. This is interesting to note because this book is still in print and is recognized as one of the major wartime biographies ever written. Joseph Barnes, the editor at Simon & Schuster, said that he worked with Eisenhower in Crusade in Europe and that the general dictated in a single session without stop 5,000 words that required almost no editing. That's 20 pages. Barnes said he had never seen such a performance in his entire newspaper and book publishing career. And during the presidential campaign, one advisor noted with exasperation that the general wasted endless time by debating commas and tenses. Eisenhower was indeed a wordsmith. I'll show you this. This is a speech draft in 1953, and this is the third draft. And look at all those are Eisenhower's scribblings around the margin, and he was constantly trying to improve the written word. His son John, as it turns out, was an English teacher, English instructor at West Point, and is now a biographer, a military biographer. I think it must be in the genes. According to Ann Whitman, Ike's secretary, personal secretary when he was president, Ike said he really should have been an editor. Ike felt passionately about that, and he edits his own dictation when he has the time, and every draft is submitted to him. And Ann said that Ike once said to me, in great disgust, that the mark of a good executive, he supposed, was to learn to sign bad letters that others had written. But in any event, when Crusade in Europe came out, one thing was for sure: Eisenhower was set financially for life. He sold the rights to this book outright to the publisher for the amount of $475,000 after taxes. He gave up all the television rights and so forth, so the publisher got a good deal, but Eisenhower got approximately $500,000 in 1948, which was real money back then, of course. And he was set for life. Although Mamie continued to clip coupons and was always looking for the bargains. And her favorite store for buying fashions was Jacques Penney, J.C. Penney. In 1948, Eisenhower, he'd been looking for a career after the military, and he thought about joining a university, and Columbia University was looking for a president, and the two came together. Columbia they had a president who was 83 years of age and had been there for 45 years, and things were getting a little stale. There was a lack of leadership, and the fundraising hadn't been happening in recent years, and the trustees were looking for a proven leader with administrative skills and who was known nationwide and would be good at fundraising. And Eisenhower certainly fit that bill. Ike always joked that to the trustees, you must want the other Eisenhower, because brother Milton Eisenhower had been president of Kansas State University and Penn State University and was later to go on and be president of Johns Hopkins University. He was the university president in the family. And so Ike did joke that, oh, you must have got the wrong number and called the wrong Eisenhower. But no, the trustees were indeed looking for Dwight Eisenhower, and he brought prestige and invigorated the university, according to the historian who's written about that time period. He left a lasting legacy. The American Assembly still operates under Columbia University. It's a think tank that writes decision papers. And he brought in large amounts of funding for the university for specific needs. And Ike did not like being a fundraiser, but he could pick up the phone and call a few friends and express a need that the university had. And and things would happen. But his tenure here was only to be about 2 years long, because in 1951, actually December 1950, he was called back to active duty by President Truman to go to NATO, the NATO headquarters in Paris, France. NATO, a military alliance to counter the Soviet threat, was an alliance in name only. It was an alliance without military teeth. And Eisenhower's task was to visit all the capitals of Europe and to get the governments to commit military troops to NATO. This is only 5 years after the end of World War II. Eisenhower knew all the players. There was not a defense minister or prime minister who he had not worked with during World War II. So he was perfect for this job and was very successful. And after his 20-month tenure at NATO, it was indeed a working military alliance. And his successors in the job, Lyman Lemnitzer and Al Grunther and Loris Norstad, all followed in that vein and worked under his careful eye when Ike was president. They had been deputies to him at NATO. And ironically, we have their papers at the Eisenhower Library, so somebody who wants to do research on the early history of NATO needs to come to the Eisenhower Library. But while he was over in the NATO headquarters, the pressures for him to run for president were building back home. There was a rally in Madison Square Garden where the crowds were shouting, "I like Ike," and this was filmed by Tex McCrary, and Jackie Cochran, the aviatrix, flew that over to Paris and showed Ike, and Mamie, and it almost brought Ike to tears to see this groundswell of support, and he allowed his name to be put in the New Hampshire primary, and indeed, he came back to the States, and in June of 1952, this is in the stadium in Abilene, Kansas, he announced his presidency. Think of that, June of 52 for a November 52 election. That was a 5-month campaign. We're already into the current campaign for next year, aren't we? It just shows how times have changed. But in 1952, there was indeed a landslide victory for Eisenhower over Adlai Stevenson, and Eisenhower was ready to assume office as President of the United States. Rarely have we had a president who was as well prepared to assume the office as Dwight Eisenhower. Think of his personal traits. He was a decision maker. He had made anything after the Normandy invasion was probably an easier decision. He was experienced. He was totally self-confident. He knew the players on the world scene, and he had credibility. In fact, when you compare him with Harry Truman, who this is the transition photo, you can see they don't look too happy with each other. The campaign had been fairly bitterly fought. But Harry Truman took office under different circumstances. The death of Franklin Roosevelt. This is what Harry told the men in the press. He said, "Boys, if you ever pray for me now. When they told me yesterday what had happened, I felt like the moon and the stars and all the planets had fallen on me." That was Harry Truman's first day in office. Eisenhower said in his diary, "My first day at the president's desk, plenty of worries and difficult problems, but such has been my portion for a long time. The result is that this just seems like a continuation of all that I've been doing since July 1941, even before that." Well, let's take a look at the Eisenhower presidency. Eisenhower used to get frustrated because people would complain that, well, it was just kind of a ho-hum period of time, and, well, 8 years of peace and prosperity, by golly, it didn't just happen, Ike would say. There was a lot going on. In March of '53, shortly after inauguration, he created the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. Ovita Kolpabee became the first female cabinet officer in his administration, and I think only the second female cabinet official in history. Something happened early on in his administration, the death of Joseph Stalin on March 5th, 1953. Eisenhower viewed this as a chance for peace, and in fact wrote a speech where he says, "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final phase a theft from those who hunger and who are not fed, from those who are cold and are not clothed." And he was urging the leaders in the Kremlin to consider a thaw in the beginnings of the Cold War, but of course that would not happen. He was also very convinced about the importance of getting the U.S. message abroad, and he created the U.S. Information Agency as a propaganda arm of the U.S., and it's been operating ever since very effectively, telling the U.S. story around the world. He had promised during his campaign to end the war in Korea, and that happened in July of 1953. the signing of that armistice. And sometimes it's not what you do, but it's who you appoint. One of his first appointments was Earl Warren as Justice of the Supreme Court. And Warren, of course, passed civil rights legislation that was in the integration of schools and other civil rights, and was a real force in history that and this is viewed also as part of Eisenhower's legacy. Eisenhower with Billy Graham. Billy Graham knew all the presidents from Harry Truman on forward, and it was once quoted as saying, "Eisenhower was the most religious president I have known," which is interesting because Eisenhower really didn't attend church that often during his military career. Perhaps that's the fact of being on bases where there were just base chapels. And Mamie was Presbyterian, and they would occasionally go to the Presbyterian church. But from Billy Graham's perspective, Ike was indeed the most religious president that he ever knew. Mamie was quoted as saying that often at night when they would go to bed, Ike's last words, verbalized out loud, was, "God, I did the best I could today." He did insert the words "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance. He started the National Prayer Breakfast. And as a youth, he had read the Bible twice. He had the gold watch to prove it. He did say that his mother allowed them to skip the Begat chapters. But he was very fond of quoting Scripture, and he knew his Bible frontwards and backwards. He also opened the cabinet meetings with a prayer. And there's kind of a cute anecdote where he was about a half an hour into a cabinet meeting, and this is where he brought out the Eisenhower temper and the Army language, and he said, "Oh, blankety blank, we forgot the blankety blank prayer." And so, but his intentions were very positive. But Eisenhower was fearful of the atomic dilemma. And the U.S. had a monopoly on atomic power early on. That changed. The Soviets developed the bomb, but he actually proposed Atoms for Peace, where the U.S. would pledge before the UN and the world its determination to help solve the atomic dilemma, and that they would actually place some of their nuclear resources in escrow for peaceful purposes. But he was not above, however, keeping the America safe, and the USS Nautilus, the first nuclear submarine, is launched in 1954. Here's Mamie breaking the champagne bottle on the bow of the Nautilus. Speaking of submarines, Eisenhower, here he is aboard the Seawolf in 1957. He was actually on a submarine in 1925 already in Panama. His boyhood friend, Sweet Hazlitt, that had gone to Annapolis, was a submarine commander, pulled into port in the Panama, and Eisenhower actually went out on a cruise in a submarine back in 1925. And it's not just the interstate highway system that Eisenhower developed in the area of transportation. He signed the St. Lawrence Seaway Bill. Here he is with Queen Elizabeth at the opening ceremonies. So we could almost call him the transportation president. Eisenhower also signed the CEDAW Treaty, committing the U.S. to the defense of Southeast Asia. This was part of his effort. The French were in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, and their fort at Dien Bien Phu fell to the Viet Minh, and Eisenhower was under extreme pressure to get us involved in Vietnam in 1954. But he resisted and said a war in that part of the world would swallow our army by the divisionful, and that was very prescient for him to say that. But he did create CEDAW along the lines of NATO to surround that part of the world and, in a concert of nations, try to provide defense for Southeast Asia. One of the things Eisenhower does occasionally receive criticism for by historians is not taking stronger action against Senator Joseph McCarthy early on. McCarthy was finally condemned by the U.S. Senate in 1954 and then disappeared from the American political scene as a factor. But Eisenhower, his view was, I am not going to get in the gutter with that man. And he worked behind the scenes to undermine him. He told the Army not to provide witnesses and testimony, and eventually the fruit dried up, and McCarthy wasn't able to continue on doing what he was doing. Fred Greenstein, a political scientist at Princeton, has written about this in a case study, and he referred to this as Eisenhower, the hidden hand presidency. And that title is kind of stuck now, as Eisenhower was quite often fond of working behind the scenes in a more subtle way to get results. It was the results that counted. You probably didn't know it, but Eisenhower was a media president. He was the first president to have a televised press conference. Actor Robert Montgomery was his media advisor. The Montgomery papers are going to be coming to the Eisenhower Library at some point, and we'll get to know more details then, as soon as the biographer of Montgomery is through. But he was on the cutting edge of a lot of things. Dr. Jonas Salk, one of the major accomplishments of the mid-50s, developed the vaccine to combat the spread of polio. And in April, Eisenhower presented him with a recognition for that effort. It's interesting that here, 50 years later, in the year 2005, our goal is to have eradicated polio from the whole world. It's still endemic in about 9 countries: India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and East Africa. And I'm a member of Rotary International, and our organization, along with the Center for Disease Control and the United Nations, have been raising large sums of money to do this final eradication of polio. Eisenhower would be very pleased with that. In 1955, Eisenhower met with the leaders of France, Britain, and the Soviet Union in Geneva in an attempt to help thaw the Cold War, and he proposed something called open skies. He told the Soviets in a surprise announcement, "We will allow your reconnaissance flights over our country if you allow ours over yours. We'll go down specific corridors. We will do it at a time and place of mutual agreement." The Soviets, of course, this was too much openness for them, and so they declined the offer. But what is ironic is that 37 years later, in 1992, there was a program started where this very thing did happen, and this is the Open Skies airplane. So this is another legacy of Eisenhower, that he was just ahead of the times. But now we do. In fact, we were having an event, an outdoor event at the Eisenhower Library with 2,000 kids on the grounds, and we were supposed to have the flyover of a B-1 bomber, but we found out 1 hour before the event that the flyover wasn't going to take place because an Open Skies day had been declared, and all of our nuclear-carrying planes had to be on the ground so that the Soviet satellites could take pictures of them. The silo lids are open, and so when we told the kids why the flight was canceled, they were impressed anyway that was happening, that they were being photographed by a satellite as they were sitting out there on the grounds of the Eisenhower Library. There were things happening on the domestic front as well. Eisenhower was a great believer in the national park system and the great outdoors. He was a fisherman and a hunter, and so he started a plan called Mission 66. This was in 1966. It was a 10-year plan for refurbishing and strengthening the national park system. So he has a legacy with the park system as well. And of course, his most famous legacy, probably, that we're all touched by almost every day, is the interstate highway system that now bears his name. And it's probably no coincidence that Interstate 70 runs right by Abilene, Kansas. I think the original plan was to go about 20 miles north, but somehow it ended up going right by Ike's hometown. I think maybe he did have a little bit of pull in this when the blueprints were set out for the state of Kansas. Eisenhower believed in diplomacy, people-to-people style. In fact, he created the people-to-people program as a civilian agency. His friend Joyce Hall of Hallmark Cards was the first organizer and funder of this, and so it's headquartered in Kansas City. And this would really make Eisenhower happy. His granddaughter, Mary, his youngest granddaughter, is the CEO of People-to-People International today. So Eisenhower would be very pleased with that. Eisenhower was reelected by landslide again in 1956. 1957, in his second term, he signed the first civil rights legislation, the 1957 Civil Rights Act. This was the first substantive civil rights legislation since Reconstruction, right after the Civil War. And it would have been stronger if it hadn't been for Southern Democrats who were resisting. But it created the Civil Rights Division in the Justice Department and called for the integration of schools. Speaking of that, when it came time to act, Eisenhower was not above enforcing court orders, for sure, and he mobilized the U.S. paratroopers in Little Rock, Arkansas, when Governor Faubus resisted allowing black teenagers to integrate Little Rock High School. I remember this as a child. On October 4th, 1957, Sputnik was launched. America sort of panicked, realizing or thinking that the Soviets were ahead of us in the space race. But Eisenhower was not shocked. He knew the status of our own program, and he knew that 3 months later we would be launching our own U.S. satellite, Explorer 1. And he created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and what is significant here is he created it under civilian authority, not military authority. America grew during the Eisenhower administration. Alaska became the 49th state, and of course, Hawaii became the 50th state. There was even a thaw in the Cold War. Nikita Khrushchev came to visit the U.S., was hosted at Camp David. And by the way, Camp David, as you know, was named after David Eisenhower. It was called Shangri-La before. Eisenhower thought that was a little too highfalutin for him, so he named it after his grandson. But unfortunately, the good intentions of the thaw in the Cold War did not come to fruition because of this little aircraft known as the U-2. Because we did not have open skies, we had a surveillance program going on. We had the U-2 flying over the Soviet Union, and on May 1st, 1960, the last flight of the U-2, the last planned flight, because satellites were coming in, took off, and it never made it. It was shot down, and the pilot survived, Francis Gary Powers. Here's Khrushchev inspecting the wreckage, and this put Khrushchev on the spot because if he had wanted to make peace with the U.S., this forced him to be tough just because of his own domestic critics. It's Francis Gary Powers testifying before Congress when he came back, when he was released. The irony of this is Gary Powers survived the crash of the U-2 at an altitude of 70 or 80,000 feet, and then died later in the 1970s in a helicopter accident as a traffic reporter for a radio station in Southern California. His son, Francis Gary Powers Jr., I've met with him, and he's trying to start a Cold War museum in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and he was born about the time his father came back, I think, from overseas. In Eisenhower's last year in office, he took a series of goodwill trips. These were kind of bittersweet experiences. He was met by millions of people in Latin America and Asia, people who really had goodwill toward the U.S. and toward Eisenhower. But Eisenhower had wanted to end his administration with a peace initiative with the Soviets, and that unfortunately didn't happen. And then one of the biggest disappointments, Eisenhower always said, was when Kennedy defeated Nixon in 1960, because it was not only a loss for his boy Dick, but it was kind of a repudiation for what Eisenhower had stood for. As he left office, he addressed the nation in the most famous speech of his time, and this is the one that's most oft requested of the library and the most oft quoted, because you have a five-star general, retired president, a cold warrior, saying, "In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by this military-industrial complex." When you have a general warning about the military-industrial complex, it certainly drives home. Now, how was Eisenhower remembered by historians? Well, unfortunately, this is how he was remembered initially: the golfing president, just the grandfatherly caretaker type. And Eisenhower was indeed a great golfer. Unlike many of his predecessors, he played the game well, usually finishing in the 80s, and even on some days, on a good day, he could shoot in the high 70s. And he got a hole-in-one finally in 1968 at the age of 77. This was in Palm Springs, California. It was a thrill of a lifetime, he said. And he loved golf, and he loved fishing, and he loved hunting. And he said, the thing about golf is it induces you to take at any one time 2 or 3 hours, if you can, where you're thinking about nothing but that little ball out there and getting away from all the toils and troubles. But as a result of this, when he left office, I should show this slide too. This is the Fitzsimmons Hospital. You can see the news item up above: the president continues to show rapid improvement, as the golf balls are coming off of the sun patio there down onto the Fitzsimmons golf course. I'm sure that's where he wanted to be, rather than up there on the hospital floor. But presidential rankings. Historians are wont to rank presidents. About every 10 years, they come out with an official presidential ranking, and I've put some of them up here: 62, 70, 82, 94, and 2000, just to show you. When Eisenhower left office, he was the 34th president. He was ranked 22nd in 1962. That's below average. That's in the bottom third. And 10 years later, 1970, not much more progress. He's ranked number 20th. But something amazing began to happen in 1980. 80s. Eisenhower is now up in the top 10 of presidents as far as historians are concerned. How did this happen? Why did this happen? Well, in part it's because of who came after Eisenhower. I mean, there were a series of failed presidencies. We had the Vietnam War, we had Watergate, we had assassinations. Eisenhower, that 8 years of peace and prosperity, started looking better and better in the context of time. The other thing is, at the Eisenhower Library, we were opening material, new material all the time, declassifying documents, opening new collections, and historians were learning for themselves that, yes, Eisenhower was in charge. Things were happening. John Foster Dulles was calling him 3 times a day when he was on an overseas trip, asking for advice and making sure that what he was doing was in concurrence with the president's wishes. So Eisenhower has grown in the esteem of historians. We at the library, we're sort of like your stockbroker. We don't care whether Eisenhower's stock is up or down as long as you're still interested and you come out and do research into Eisenhower. Let's finish by looking at the Colorado connection. Ike and Colorado. And there were many things that attracted him to Colorado. Of course, Mamie Dowd would be first and foremost. When he met this 19-year-old beautiful young girl in San Antonio, his life was changed forever. He was one of 6 boys, as we said. Susan Eisenhower, in her biography of her grandmother, Mamie said, when Ike saw Mamie, it was as if this pink fluffy thing had fallen out of heaven, and landed in front of him. It was something totally alien to him. And they were married 53 years and had a wonderful life together. Eisenhower was actually stationed once in Colorado at Fort Logan with the recruiting service in 1925, awaiting going to Leavenworth to attend the Command and General Staff College. Axel Nielsen, a name familiar to most of you here, was a good friend of Eisenhower. Eisenhower spent many, many days and weeks fishing, fly fishing with Axel. Here they are, I think, tying some flies up in the mountains. And you know that Eisenhower was an oil painter. He painted 300 paintings over his lifetime that we know of. He gave most of them away. We have about 24 at the library in Abilene, but somebody would compliment him on a painting and he would say, "Here, take it." Today they're worth tens of thousands of dollars, but many of his landscapes were of Colorado scenes. Here he is grilling some fish with, probably with Axel Nielsen, some of the trout they had just caught. His grandkids gave him an apron to use during these occasions, and it said, "Hail to the chef." Of course, the Brown Palace Hotel is where he spent much time, too, during the campaigns. This was his summer headquarters. And it's no accident that his presidential airplane, Air Force One, was actually called the Columbine. And here's Mamie on the Columbine. It was the old Super Constellation. Mamie didn't like to fly. She had an inner ear problem, and they always told her that they would never go above 3,000 feet. And when they did, she would just say, "Oh, look, aren't those people small down there?" And say, yes, they are, but they never told her what the actual altitude. Here's another Eisenhower painting of the Columbine. Retirement in Denver. This was actually considered by Eisenhower. In 1947, when he was leaving the Army, he wrote his father-in-law, John Sheldon Dowd, and said, "One of the problems that, of course, faces Mamie and me constantly is that of choosing a place to live after retirement. I had about come around to the feeling that Denver was the best spot in which we could make our home. But now the doctor says that as Mamie grows older, she should avoid more and more the higher altitudes." And so they selected another location, Gettysburg. But actually, of course, the altitudes may not have been that good for Eisenhower, as we found out later. Here's something that may surprise you. Great-grandson Alex Eisenhower is currently a third-year student at CU in Boulder. This is David Eisenhower and Julie Nixon's son. They're from Pennsylvania. He was looking for a good college to go to and picked CU. So there's another. The Eisenhower connection lives. And of course, last but not least, the Fitzsimmons Hospital. What a wonderful connection this was for Eisenhower, and it is the reason that he had a second term, and much better thanks, as Eisenhower would have said. Now, Eisenhower's life spanned many of the great events of recent history: the emergence of the automobile, the interstate highway, manned flight, black civil rights, 2 world wars, the greatest military amphibious landing in the history of mankind, space flight. And Ike was at the center of these events and played a crucial role in most of them. His son John said of his father on the occasion of the Eisenhower Centennial in 1990 before Congress at a special program, this is what John said: Ike Eisenhower was a complex man, full of contradictions. Beneath the well-known grin, he was a serious, purposeful executive. He made no pretense at intellectual brilliance, but he was contemplative and literate. He walked with kings, but never forgot his home in Abilene, Kansas. He was the vaunted warrior who hated war. He was the five-star general who warned of the dangers of an unbridled military-industrial complex. Ike thought of himself primarily as a dedicated public servant, one who placed his country above himself, and serving his country in an ever-shrinking world meant that he was serving the whole of mankind. He did not crave fame, for his personal self-esteem was too strong for that. He was nearly indispensable, John says. The people of the United States were lucky during the 1950s to have good soldier Ike in control of our nuclear arsenal. Yes, Eisenhower's was a life well lived, and because of the care and rehabilitation he received from the outstanding medical team and staff here at the Fitzsimmons Army Hospital, that life was several years longer than it might otherwise have been. And for that, the Eisenhower family and the American people, thank you.